The nuclear apocalypse led the survivors of the Metro down many different paths and ideologies, and in the dark tunnels under ruined Moscow, a new iteration of the Reich has risen. It now begins its march towards control over the entire Metro, or so it may try. Firstly, where did the Fourth Reich actually come from? Well, it's said that it emerged from the Russian Nationalist Unity Party, which was a pre-nuclear war, pro-Russian nationalist political group. And in the brutal environment of the Metro, in-group, out-group preference tends to become the norm. So with them believing in such things as the Metro is for Russians and do a good deed, clean up the Metro, which were slogans shouted when the group rose to prominence in the Reich's original station of Pushkinskaya. This also led to all non-ethnic Russians being expelled from the station. Now what interests me is what do they class as ethnic Russians? Because as we all know, Russia is a vast nation which has many ethnic groups from Russians, Tatars, Ukrainians, Baskirs and many more. Now I personally think they only include ethnic Russians of European stock in their ideology, but it's never 100% clear. But in the games we only encounter ethnic-looking Russians in the Reich's ranks, and it's stated in the novels that the Reich does go from being outright hostile to all non-ethnic Russians to eventually being more anti-freak and anti-mutant and allowing non-ethnic Russians into its ranks. So it's a little hard to pin the ideology down 100%. We do know that they consider freaks and mutants a pretty loose term, with anyone that has a slight deformity found in the Metro to be considered a lower race and treated as a second-class citizen. However, another trait unique to this post-war world is the strict regulations that are heavily emphasised by the Reich, and it's always improving their standards. They want humanity to be rid of abnormal genes caused by radiation. If a person is missing 2 fingers or even a toe, the penalty is normally death. Recently, more strict standards have been imposed such as height and even head size. The Reich's race and genetic standards cause many people living inside the Reich to flee and become refugees, and that's if they can flee, as trying to escape is considered a crime and it's normally punished by death. And we actually see in Metro Last Light, when you're captured by the Reich officers near the prison camp, he's actually measuring someone's head and declares him a mutant and, well, I think you can guess the next bit. So once Pushkinskaya had been secured, they quickly expanded into Tverskaya and Chekhovskaya, which gave the Reich 3 group stations, which is a huge benefit in terms of defence and logistics. But the Reich was quickly shunned and cut off from the rest of the Metro due to their ideology of genetic purity and the fact that they deem anyone who is not up to their standards to be no better than cattle. Any outsiders who are captured by the Reich are either killed, enslaved, and the Reich doesn't really mess around when it comes to doing these things. It is brutally effective in its actions, and this is why they have made no friends in the Metro, just enemies, and some very powerful ones at that, with the Red Line being their number one opponent, and both these factions have been caught up in an endless meat grinder war for years. I guess history does repeat itself. Being cut off from the Metro didn't stop their dreams of expansion though, and the Reich established many small outposts on the surface, and there are rumours that it has purely military stations in the Metro, but I haven't found which ones it was able to take or establish footholds in, but there are many abandoned stations it could do this to. And obviously the Reich tends to attack places via the surface, which is the least expected way. We actually see this in the first game where they're going to hit a metro station from above and the population is trying to flee. So realistically, they can attack any station as long as it has clear surface access. That's if they can blast their way through the reinforced doors, but the Reich is determined if nothing else. They have some influence on the stations around them, normally a bad one, which has made more neutral factions like Polis fortify its borders with the Reich. Not that they would try to attack Polis directly, well, I sure hope not, otherwise they would find themselves with the entire Metro descending upon them. Now this isolation that has been imposed on the Reich, which is well warranted, and who can blame the other factions as the Reich doesn't exactly extend a friendly welcome to others. It also limits the Reich's ability to trade. Officially there is zero trade between them and others, but unofficially we know Hansa trades with them, and most likely through their overland outposts they're able to trade with some smaller factions further out, and these factions will care little for politics of the inner metro, so they're quite happy to trade with the Reich as long as they're getting what they need. And end of the day, there is one most important rule in the metro: survival. So it doesn't matter if it's a fascist, a communist, or whoever. If they've got what you need, you're probably going to trade. Now you might be thinking, what would the Reich have to trade? Well, they've become rather self-sufficient in their years of isolation, and their weapons and armour is top-notch. And their most valued commodity, well, it's slaves. It's rumoured that the Reich trades slaves and prisoners with other stations, but who really knows? One major thing is they have a strong presence on the surface, which is arguably the strongest of any faction, for their size, rivaling the Rangers on number of outposts, and even Hansa in Metro Exodus, as yes, Hansa had the train station, but their presence was very centralised, the Reich was very spread out. So due to this surface presence, the Reich has access to pre-war weapons and technology, which is confirmed with some of the weapons on the Panzers, as these parts are the barrels and turrets of some of the older Russian APCs that are pre-war. Also, fresh supplies that are scavenged from the pre-apocalypse world that have not been touched. So the Reich has access to far more than most realise. And I'm sure many rare parts and items are procured thanks to the Reich's surface forces. Obviously, they're probably traded through Hansa, and then they get down the line, so it's not officially from the Reich, but most likely it does come from them. What about internal life in the Reich? Obviously, such a brutal regime must be awful to live under. Well, not as all as straightforward as you might think. So the standards, as I mentioned before, of who can live and even be born in the Reich are very high. This means many flee or are ejected from the territory, normally by a bullet to the head. This results in a lower population compared to factions like the Red Line or Hansa, but on the whole the Reich's population is healthier, suffering from less genetic and health defects. But they're in such a rough environment as the Metro, so people still obviously get sick. One interesting point is how clean the Reich stations and tunnels are in comparison to the rest of the Metro, and this is most likely due to the ruthless enforcement of its laws. It's said that the Reich does have its own version of the Gestapo, the secret police, but only rumours and whispers are heard about them. But civilians here seem content and comfortable. They are shielded from the realities of the war and the atrocities the Reich commits, but they do know a war is occurring, as the Reich is on a permanent war footing, as its economy is as well, with everyone doing the most for the war effort, which must put a strain on resources like luxuries for the civilians, but, they don't really complain, otherwise, well, it doesn't end well. One situation that definitely impacts the future of the Reich is that men massively outnumber women, so future offspring is limited, and when you factor in its laws about deformities and mutations, well, the Reich seems to be on the path to extinction, whether they win their war or not. The population of the Reich, whether they be civilian or military, are exposed to large amounts of propaganda, in a sense brainwashed to believe in the ideology and the war they fight, similar to what the Red Line does, just a very different point of view. This keeps the population in line mostly, and some people become die-hard fanatics willing to do anything for the glory of the Reich, and we see this in some of the war chants used by troops on the front lines. They are, Hail Reich, die subhuman. Now you die for the Reich. Time to die subhuman. Death to mutants, death to commies, which I approve. Eat lead, you commie pig. Damn mutants. Now commie, you're done for. Death to subhumans. Reminds me a little bit of Liberty Prime, so yeah, kind of interesting to see all the slogans they kind of come out with, and obviously you'll hear these if you play the Metro games. A horrifying thing that is seen in the games and hinted at in the novels is the use of slave labour by the Reich. And we know that some of the so-called collective farm stations use slaves, so I put my bullets on the Reich doing it as well. This would support how the Reich is able to keep its war economy going and maintained against such a larger faction like the Red Line, literally working so-called freaks to death on very limited food and water for maximum output. Horrifying, yet highly effective. And there is always a risk of a slave or prison revolt which could spell major internal trouble for the Reich. Some lesser confirmed rumours are that the Reich is trading these undesirables in their terms with other stations. Now, if this is true, it would most likely be with those collective farms, but I wouldn't put it past Hansa to trade slaves unofficially. If it makes a profit, well, it makes sense to them. On the note of the Reich's economy, well, they must be self-sufficient in some resources like food, clean water and ammunition, as even though they do get a little bit of trade in, they must use like surface scavenging or something else to boost these kind of resource production and stockpiles, because a single day without food or bullets on the front line could spell disaster, and there's always an unexpected emergency around the corner. So the Reich must have basically, through their isolation, become more self-sufficient, but we never really get much of an insight into the true internal workings of this faction, so based off the evidence we'll just have to go with what we have. But who leads the citizens of the Reich? Well, of course, it's the Führer. Very little is known about the man, but he rules with absolute authority, and the power is very centralised around him. This puts a very heavy burden on his shoulders and means success might rely on whether he makes a good or bad decision. It does allow for very quick choices to be made, and in the Reich's constant state of war, this is very necessary. Now, there is an unofficial backstory that was cut from the Metro games, but it's pretty interesting, so I'm going to include it. The Führer was born and raised in the Reich, a Nazi state hell-bent on achieving complete racial and genetic purity. Yet when the Führer was still a simple stormtrooper, his beautiful wife gave birth to a disfigured baby, with an oversized head and extra fingers. Correctly seeing this as an end to any prospect for a political career, the future Führer put the baby in a plastic bag and dumped it alive. His wife went mad and he locked her up for life in a solitary cell under a false accusation. Denial of this crime, whilst wishing to prove that anyone would have done the same in his shoes, made the Führer take an extremely antagonistic position to all and any mutants, turning the faction's predisposition against them into his own personal vendetta. Denial of any possible genetic trash within himself turned the Führer into the most outspoken advocate of genetic purity. Hatred toward himself and fear of his secret being uncovered drove the Führer to begin this mad crusade against the unfortunate mutants. I must admit this is a brutal but kind of cool backstory, so yeah, I wish they had included it in the game, but this happens a lot, things do get caught. The Reich's military seems to have a very disciplined and skilled leadership, with officers and non-commissioned officers being the best for the job. True merit in action, and this is backed up by the fact that the Reich cannot afford for its military to fail, as it's the only thing keeping them alive in the Metro. So officers must be the best. There's no place for favouritism or nepotism, though I imagine it still happens, but the officers' belief in the Reich must be fanatical, to keep the soldiers fighting until their last breath, and anyone who would try to desert or surrender will be disciplined with a bullet to the back of the head. Most of the Fourth Reich's ranks are based on the SS and Wehrmacht ranking system. They are generally heard throughout the games when Reich troops are not alert. I'm not going to try and pronounce the German, but I'll put it on screen and I'll just say what rank fits it. So this is Major, Technical Sergeant, Captain, Regimental Sergeant Major, Sergeant, Supreme Commander, and then the last one actually means, that translates from the Third Reich as was a battalion, translating to Sturm Battalion or Storm Division, and it's either a subdivision of the Reich's military or a rank reserved for stormtroopers. So there might be some kind of translation things in the game that didn't go exactly to plan, but they're the ranks. And it's quite interesting that even though it's not technically a direct descendant from the German Reich, even though it's called the Fourth Reich, and even though it's based on Russian ethnic purity, they're still using German words, which is kind of a strange hybrid crossover, but yeah, it's kind of gives it a cool feel in the games, I must admit. It kind of obviously gives you that sense that this is the Nazi Reich, but it's slightly different, so it's a bit odd. The Reich has a range of different troop types, with the main ones encountered falling into these categories. Troopers, these make up the backbone of the Reich's military. Their main purpose in the Reich is to fight on the front lines and engage the enemy. Reich troops are very well equipped and well trained compared to normal troops of most stations, especially the Red Line, who in comparison are barely trained, and pound for pound they're some of the best in the Metro. They are usually equipped with an automatic rifle, carry an abundance of grenades and wear strong body armour, but this varies on location and what their mission is. Next are the Stalkers. These are the elite soldiers who have to go up to the surface and retrieve supplies, food, weapons or books to help keep the Reich well equipped and alive. Reich Stalkers are much better equipped than Stalkers of other stations, especially the Red Line, and they have better armour and filtration systems, and many are seen with oxygen tanks allowing them to have an independent source of air in case their filters are damaged, as getting the filters wet or kind of knocked about on the surface can obviously reduce their lifetime. This is really where the Reich has a major advantage, as the surface presence is massive and arguably larger than most of the Metro combined. They even have vehicles on the surface like buggies with mounted machine guns to give them a major edge in any engagements. Then there's scouts, which make up a smaller portion of the Reich's army. Their main purpose is to scout out enemy positions and find weaknesses. They are not as well equipped as normal soldiers, and they don't carry a lot of armour. They usually have something like a bastard machine gun, maybe a grenade and a trench knife, prioritising speed and stealth over combat ability. Then we have the Reich's notorious heavies. They have an important role in the Reich's military, as their main purpose is to reinforce weak spots and mow down enemy infantry. They can destroy heavy targets such as Red Line light buggies, which are cheap imitation of the Reich's panzers. These heavies are very strong and, like other Reich soldiers, undergo extensive training. They are very well equipped with full body armour and are usually seen with something like either a shambler with grenades Or in the case of Hans, which is the DLC I believe, he has a Gatling gun. A single Reich heavy soldier can turn the tide of an entire battle. The Reich emphasises the use of equipment over losing lives. Guns and grenades can be replaced, but men cannot. So a large part of their doctrine is to use superior weapons and tactics to minimise casualties. And we see the Reich's troops armed with some of the best weapons in the Metro, with Kalashnikov rifles, Sega shotguns, and high quality Metro made weapons being common. Though in Metro Last Light we see Reich troops poorly armed and equipped, this is more due to it being the start of the game, and the developers didn't want you to have access to the best weapons straight away, which is pretty lame, but yeah, makes sense. Most of their weapons are heavily modified to suit the soldiers' needs, and even the lowliest of the soldiers have ample supplies of ammunition and grenades. It's a very different strategy to war than the Red Line, but it's not for love of their people, but necessity, because as I said before, the population is far lower than most other factions, so every person is a valuable strategic resource. One thing that has really been able to tip the balance of battles in the Reich's favour by 2033 is the large pool of trolley cars that have been armoured and armed up. These range from light ones with a light machine gun attached all the way up to the so-called panzers named after the German tanks themselves. These are heavily armed machines in Metro terms, and they're almost immune to small arms gunfire and light explosives like fragmentation grenades. The only effective way of taking down these beasts is powerful explosive charges, large caliber weapons, 50 caliber or above, or something like getting a grenade inside the armour, but getting up close to a panzer when it's deployed with a Reich squad is pretty risky. Now this large pool of militarised vehicles allows the Reich to bring heavy firepower on a mobile chassis, and when they need more ammo or repairs, they can quickly return to the rear lines for safe maintenance. And unlike Hansa, who also has trolley cars for the military, the Reich is far smaller and more concentrated, so they only have 3 connecting lines into their territory, and they seem to be on decent terms with the collective farms, and they have no conflict with Polis at this time, which leads just one active line available, which they share with the Red Line. So the Reich can bring their entire motorised arsenal to a single front line, and this brings a potential for a rapid advance if they have undamaged rail lines to use. If they could get a panzer to another station, it might be one of the few times in Metro history where an attacking force could take a station without it becoming a meat grinder of attrition. But I'm sure the Red Line has its sappers ready with large amounts of explosives, just in case the Reich try it. Now there is one Wunderwaffe the Reich has invested considerable resources into, a massive armoured train very similar to what the Red Line used in Metro Last Light. This beast is a converted pre-war Metro train, and it's been armed up to make it impervious to even most heavy weapons. It has a panzer turret on top, and a vehicle like this is a huge undertaking, but it has the potential to be a massive breakthrough weapon. Almost any fortification will fall if it smashes through it. It does rely on a well-maintained set of rails to move, but maybe this is the key to the Reich's expansion plans. If they're ever going to truly break out of their 3 main stations, they need a tool that can punch right through the outer station defence lines. And if quickly followed by panzers, well maybe this might be their own version of the Blitzkrieg. And we'll actually see this from many nations, or stations should I say, come and get these armoured trains. We see obviously in Exodus, Hansa has the one on the surface. We obviously saw the Red Line one in Metro Last Light. But due to the kind of warfare that happens in the Metro, maybe this is what happens. You need these kind of super Wunderwaffe weapons to actually break through any fortification, because even isolated small stations can dig in so well, but it basically becomes a war of attrition, but no one has the manpower to really do it effectively, so armoured trains seem like the best way to actually try and break through these kind of tough defensive lines. I think the Reich's plan in military terms is to wait for the larger factions to be under pressure from a crisis or a war, and if they're able to maintain their borders with the use of the panzers, heavy fortifications like we see in the bridge on the first game, with in-place weapons, fortified positions and booby traps laid all over the place, this would buy time for the Reich stalkers on the surface to make their move, assaulting stations from above. And we also saw in the first game the stalkers were planning to hit a station that was isolated and weak. If they do this kind of rapid shock trooper campaign and seize some valuable stations, it might be enough to really cement the Reich's position as a stronger power, but it's a very high risk, high reward strategy, and for the troops in the Metro, they need to use things like the scouts to provoke a response from larger factions like the Red Line, so they then do a counter-attack. This is how the Reich can actually use their heavy defensive fortifications to choke the enemy's manpower, and obviously for a very little manpower return for the Reich, so in the long term they're able to grind their enemy down without taking too many losses. It's going to be pretty risky, like I say, it's got to be planned to the exact minute, and any hiccups could spell disaster and the end of the Fourth Reich. And also in the later novels it's hinted that the Reich wants to do one final crusade, maybe at the Polis, the beating heart of the Metro, so obviously the Reich might realise their time is almost up, so if the Reich dies, so does everyone else, but let's be honest, the Reich's strong, but they're not strong enough to take on the entire metro. They're a very concentrated and strong force in a small area. But for instance, if they were attacked by Hansa, who could attack them through, I believe it's one of the connecting lines. There's an abandoned station between them and Hansa. There's also the collective farms, which would probably not get involved, but there's obviously Polis, and there's the Red Line. So yeah, the Reich would have to be very, very careful. Right, I'll just say I did balls up on my explanation of the Reich's location and the connecting lines. I meant kind of what the active lines were. So the Reich actually has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 connections into the territory, but they're not all active. So obviously the line between them and Polis, neutral, nothing going on. There's 2 lines that connect to the Red Line, but it's more active between Tverskaya to Lubyanka, I believe it's pronounced. That's the more active one. But there's realistically, because it's one Reich station with 2 tunnels, it's one active front. There is a line that connects them potentially to Hansa, but there's an abandoned station in between, so that's basically a quiet line. There's also a connection between the Reich and the collective farms, but there's D6 in between, which they don't know about, and obviously that doesn't really have any action on it. And they do have a line to the 1905 Confederation, which seems to be fairly quiet. So yeah, I messed that up. Sorry, I was looking at a fan-made map. I mixed up my research, but realistically, the Reich is only fighting with the Red Line most of the time. They're heavily entrenched, they're heavily militarized. The 1905 Confederation, not strong enough to take on the Reich, they're not getting involved. Polis stays neutral as much as it can. Hansa stays out of it, and obviously because it's quite a large line between them, and there's a connecting abandoned station, it's not a very active line unless the Reich makes a move, which they haven't got the manpower. And the collective farms seem like the biggest kind of chance for the Reich to trade, obviously slaves or prisoners, so I don't see that kicking off. So it's basically them and the Red Line via 2 actual tunnels, but there's 1 Reich station. And yeah, I feel like realistically it's 1 active front line. Anyway, apologies for that. I got my research balls up, but I have amended it. So, and in the comments saying blah 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 blah, you got it wrong. Yep, I amended it here, but I've already recorded all the footage now, or the audio, and I haven't obviously got time to do the entire video again. Unfortunately, that's just life. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my explanation of the Fourth Reich. A little bit off, but I got most things right. I hope. I hope it kind of expanded your metro knowledge, and then you enjoyed the video. And as always, thanks for watching, guys, and have a beautiful evening.